시각도 참 한 새벽입니다. 그래서 너무 미안하긴 하지만 우리가 영상을 보고 있으면 한 7시 50분쯤 들어와 주실 텐데 그때 인사하고 라이브 Q&A 진행할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 한 몇 분 조금만 더 기다려보고 시작을 할게요. 이 좋은 강의를 놓치시는 분이 있으면 안 되는데. 안녕하세요. 지금 한 분씩 들어오고 계시는데요. 몇 분, 한 5분까지는 아니고 한 2, 3분 정도 더 기다려보고서 시작을 하겠습니다. 저는 화면을 끈 게 노트북이 너무 낡아가지고요. 화면을 켜면 이게 언제 멈출지 모릅니다. 네, 레비칼에서 교수님이 답장을 보내셨네요. See you in a little less than an hour라고 보내셨습니다. 곧 볼 수 있겠습니다. 아이고. 공동 호스트님들이 너무 열일을 해주고 계셔서 너무 감사합니다. 어제 이어서 소은님이 또 통역을 해주실 거고요. 제가 전체 화면을 공유하고 있어가지고 이걸 잘 못 보고 있어서 의영님이 게스트 분을 한 분 한 분 초대해 주시고 계십니다. 어제에 이어서 여기 오늘도 참석해 주신 분들 너무 감사하고요. 특히 태령님은 너무 일찍부터 와주셔가지고 너무 반갑게 지켜보고 있었습니다. 혼자 외롭게 지키고 있던 이 방에서. 하트. 감사합니다. 자, 이제 슬슬 시작해 볼까요? 시작을 해보겠습니다. 자, 시작하겠습니다.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Rebecca Lester, and I'm very happy to join you today for the 2026 Eating Disorder Awareness Week. I'm a professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm also a private practice therapist specializing in eating disorders, trauma, and borderline personality disorder. I'm also, which is relevant for this talk, an eating disorder survivor myself. I went through treatment twice, once when I was 11, again when I was 18, and I struggled off and on for many years with an active eating disorder. I'm very grateful to say that I've now been in recovery for about half my lifetime. So I'm very relieved to be past that, but that experience directly informs the work I'm going to talk about today. I'm the author of a book called Famished, Eating Disorders and Failed Care in America. And today I'm going to tell you about that book and what I've learned from that research. So this story begins with an ending. On a hot, sticky summer afternoon, I left the Cedar Grove Eating Disorder Clinic where I had been conducting research and drove to the local parish church. As I wound my way through the idyllic Midwestern American suburb, I passed the usual summer scenes. Children playing in sprinklers, shoppers at the local farmer's market, families out for a stroll. The sun was shining. It was peaceful and calm. The cheers from the nearby soccer field a joyful soundtrack to an exquisite summer day. Yet all this small-town charm felt hollow and callous to me, sitting as it did in grisly counterpoint to where I was headed. A funeral for a young woman named Allison, who had been a patient at Cedar Grove the previous spring. Until 3 days prior, Allison had been a success story. When she left the clinic, she was healthy, invested in her recovery, thankful to be alive, and eager to get on with her life. Now she was dead. She had a heart attack and died on the night of her 27th birthday. Allison was not my personal client, but I had come to know her fairly well during the time she was in treatment at Cedar Grove. In treatment, Allison worked hard, and over time she made great strides toward health. By the time she was discharged 4 weeks later, Allison was medically and psychologically stable and looking forward to returning to her life. 4 months later, she was dead. At the funeral, Carmen and Sheila, two clients who had known Allison at the clinic and were still in treatment there, were sitting in the pew in front of me. They had gotten special passes from the clinic for the day so they could attend. I noticed that Carmen drew uneasy stares from the surrounding mourners. She had a feeding tube conspicuously inserted through her nose, the end of it taped awkwardly to her cheek. In the humid summer heat, the tape curled up at the corners, her hands fluttering up repeatedly to press it back into place. Sheila, sitting next to Carmen, looked stoic and closed down, staring straight ahead into the distance. Both Carmen and Sheila looked visibly tense, their bodies held tight and rigid in the wooden pew. Carmen cried silently during the service, the tears snaking their way down her cheeks. Sheila sat as still as a stone. Despite their obvious distress, I was glad to see both of them there. Not only because they'd been so close to Allison, but also because I thought it might be a catalyst for them in their own recoveries, perhaps jolting them to awareness that this, death, could happen to them too. But later, back at Cedar Grove, Sheila told me that Allison's death had actually made her even less hopeful and motivated about recovery than before. It's just like, why fight it, she asked me. Once you have this thing for so long, it's going to kill you one way or another. So what's the point of trying to get better? Sheila's question was more than simply rhetorical. She wanted me to tell her why she should keep trying when she had cycled through treatment 3 different times, each time having to leave far before she was ready because her insurance ran out, and each time relapsing into a ferocious spiral of bulimia and self-harm. She wanted to know why she should keep trying when her parents had given up on her, her sister had stopped speaking to her, and now, including Allison, she had lost 3 friends in the last year to an eating disorder. Maybe I just can't do life, Sheila concluded, looking at her hands. My book, Famished, is about how people care and make sense of caring in the face of what seem to be insurmountable odds. Clients who often don't want to get better, families who are in crisis yet resist change, an illness that kills more people than almost any other psychiatric condition, and a healthcare system that devalues the very sorts of clinical expertise that seem to help. It's about how clients and clinicians alike get caught up in these knots and must struggle to find a way forward, racing against the clock and the specter of disappearing benefits to access treatment that is complex, contradictory, and in far too many cases, counterproductive. Allison's death is an exemplar of the tragedies that can result from this situation. It's true that eating disorders are virulent, progressive conditions that do not easily relinquish their hold on sufferers. It is also true that many people with eating disorders are often ambivalent about getting well. But to figure Allison's relapse and death as a product of her personal relationship with her illness elides the ways in which care itself becomes complicit in continuing and exacerbating suffering. I come to these issues motivated by the question of why this is the case and how we got here. So before moving on, I want to say something about my own positionality because it's really critical to the research and the perspectives that I bring. I am, as I mentioned before, a cultural anthropologist. I've been a professor of anthropology for the past 25 years and have worked in the field of culture and mental health, particularly interested in psychiatry as a cultural practice. I am also a clinician. I've been a licensed clinical social worker since 2010 and have been working clinically with eating disorders and associated conditions for many years. And I also have a personal history with eating disorders. As I noted, struggling in treatment when I was 11 and again when I was 18, but really battling eating disorder on and off until I was almost 30 years old. So these are the three perspectives I bring to this research. So I'll start with talking about my role as an anthropologist. So anthropologists are interested in getting at the story behind the story. We want to understand how and why things that we observe in cultural life are the way that they are, not just on a superficial level, but really digging deep to understand how things have gotten to be the way that they are and what sustains them in the configurations that we find them in. So that's the mindset that I first approached this research with, is trying to understand why eating disorders remain such a problematic set of issues to grapple with, even though they've been around for so long and we've spent so much time trying to understand them. They still remain such a conundrum and such a difficulty, both for clients and for clinicians trying to work with them. So what is this story, like I said, that I wanted to get behind? So eating disorders, we know, affect millions of Americans. And in this talk, I will be talking specifically about the American context because that's where I've conducted my research. But of course, much of what I say here is applicable around the world. Eating disorders are a widespread global phenomenon that affects, millions and millions of people across the globe. But for the purposes of this research, I was focusing on the American context. And we know that 30 million Americans in their lifetimes will be affected by an eating disorder, which is more than twice as many people as are diagnosed with Alzheimer's and 5 times as many as diagnosed with schizophrenia. Eating disorders affect a range of people, male, female, young and old, Black, white, brown, rich, poor. They do not adhere to the strict stereotype that we have been fed through the media primarily, and also through clinical literature, of the kind of young, white, affluent, anorexic teenager. Eating disorders are much more diverse and more complex than that, and they affect, like I said, people in all different demographic domains. Eating disorders are also dangerous. They have the second highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses, about 10 to 20%, just behind opioid addiction. They cause a number of physical complications, including cardiac arrhythmia, cardiac arrest, brain damage, osteoporosis, infertility, and of course death. And the mental anguish of eating disorders is tremendous, and it persists long beyond the medical consequences. So these are very dangerous conditions. And every 62 minutes, at least one person dies as a direct result of an eating disorder. The good news about all of this is that eating disorders are actually treatable. They can be successfully and fully treated, and recovery is possible. But research has shown that only 1 in 10 people with an eating disorder receives treatment, and only 35% of those people receive necessary specialized treatment for an eating disorder. So without proper treatment, we see multiple rehospitalizations, and the rate of recovery from an eating disorder plummets. So this puts us in a situation where our eating disorder recovery rates are far lower than what we would expect to see after all of these years of study and treatment of these conditions. About 50% of the population recovers, 30% improve somewhat, and 20% remain chronically ill or die. 1 in 5. That is far too many. And although eating disorders are the second deadliest of all mental disorders, they are the least covered, among the least covered by insurance in the United States. And I'll say more about the American healthcare system in a moment and why this is such an important component of the story. So they're among the least covered by insurance. Eating disorders are allotted only a fraction of the research dollars as other conditions. So I mentioned Alzheimer's and schizophrenia prior, and both of those conditions receive far more research funding than eating disorders by an order of magnitude. And as a result, millions of Americans remain untreated or undertreated for these deadly conditions. So in terms of the story behind the story, as an anthropologist, I wanted to understand why. How did we get here when we have these conditions that are so prevalent and so widespread, but are so neglected in terms of research and treatment funding? And I was also wanting to understand better, what are the on-the-ground consequences of this situation? And most importantly, how can we work to improve it? We know some of the on-the-ground consequences I shared earlier with cases like Allison's, and we see this far too often. And so how can we work to improve this situation? So this was really the really motivating questions behind the start of this research. So I began my work doing this research as an ethnography of an American eating disorder clinic that I call Cedar Grove, as I mentioned before in my opening vignette. What started off as a kind of straightforward ethnographic study of this treatment center evolved into research and clinical practice that spanned 7 years and far beyond. So here's a schematic of my timeline. So when I first started, for the first 2 years, I was at Cedar Grove. I was doing traditional ethnography, and I'll say more about what that means in a minute. But I was there purely as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist. And then after I was there for about 2 years, I really felt very passionate. I felt very passionately about the fact that I felt like I needed to do more. Anthropology is incredibly valuable. Ethnography is a fantastic tool, but particularly as someone who had come from having my own experience with these illnesses, being in the clinical space and being talking to so many people who were in the midst of struggling with this, I really felt like I wanted to be able to do more to help them. And so I decided at that point to go back to school and get my clinical degree in social work and to get clinical training so that I could, ethically and appropriately work with people more directly in that sort of sense. So in the process of pursuing my master's of social work degree, I was a clinical trainee, which I did those practicums at Cedar Grove. So I was able to get specific training through that clinic as I was continuing my work as an ethnographer. So I did that for about 3 years, those two roles. Once I completed all my training and I was able to get my independent license, I continued to work at Cedar Grove as a therapist for about 2 years while I was continuing with the ethnographic research. And then I moved into private practice, private psychotherapy practice, and involvement in local and state eating disorder advocacy organizations like the Missouri Eating Disorder Council. And I've been doing that work for the past 16 years. So that gives you kind of a sense of where this research fell, and that it really was a process for me. And it was an evolution of me also figuring out, how do I want to position myself in relation to this topic, to this research, to the people that I'm working with. And so I was able, fortunately, to make this all work together, thankfully, and it really afforded me not only the skills and the tools to do the clinical work that I wanted to do, but also gave me some really unique, I think, insights into the clinician perspective on what's happening in these treatment centers that is really difficult to capture otherwise if you haven't actually done it yourself. So it all worked out well from that perspective. So I'll tell you a bit more about how that all looked. So in terms of my key methods, so as an ethnographer, we really focus on long-term participant observation, which means we spend a long time with people, getting to know them, getting to understand their experiences, how the world feels and looks and is experienced from their perspective as best we can. Of course, we can't fully ever understand someone else's perspective, but we do what we can by spending a lot of time with people, and we not only observe them, we talk to them, we're looking at interactions. And so for the purposes of this research, I spent a lot of time hanging out at this eating disorder clinic and really observing the everyday running of the clinic. How did things get done? What was the schedule? Who did what? What were the interactions like? What were the power dynamics like? Who made decisions? Who had to maneuver around different personalities, all these things that you might expect to find in any sort of clinical setting or any social setting, really. So observing the everyday running of the clinic, I participated in therapy groups. And I should really emphasize here that everybody at the clinic, including all the clients, all the clinicians, they all knew that I was there as an anthropologist and an ethnographer as part of a research project that I was doing. So they all consented to be part of that project as long as I maintained their confidentiality. So when I talk about things like therapy groups or treatment team meetings, please know that that was only done with the express consent of the participants. So I did participate in a lot of the different therapy groups. I would go on outings when they would have client outings. I participated in client meals. On the clinical side, I was in all the treatment team meetings where clinicians would gather to talk about all the clients and what their goals and struggles might be for the upcoming week and things. Any trainings that were provided to the clinicians I was part of, and of course, observing client and clinician interactions in the course of clinic life. So all told, I spent about 5,000 hours doing these kinds of activities over the length of time that I was there. Obviously, I was there for a long time, but it was about 5,000 hours over all that time. And then my foundation and specialization practicums, those are the parts of my clinical training that I mentioned earlier. And then I also had to do 3,000 hours of supervised clinical work in order to get my independent license. So that's when I was working at the clinic as a therapist. During my training, I was getting my supervised hours in order to get my independent license. So that's how all that stuff fit together. So it was a lot of time and a lot of different roles that I had at the clinic during the course of this work. So what was I looking for? I was looking for really anything and everything. When you're an ethnographer, you don't yet know what's going to be important. So you go in taking note of anything and everything that you think could be relevant. You become able to hone that more as you go along. But that includes things like how people use space. How is the furniture organized? What is the flow? What is the feeling? Are the clinician offices kept behind a locked door that you have to have a code to get into? These kinds of things, right? What does that communicate about power differentials or accessibility? So, these kinds of questions. I looked at how people interacted with one another, how they formed cliques, how they responded to change, how clients or clinicians followed or did not follow program rules, who got to make decisions about things, how they were implemented or not. What kinds of alternative discourses might be going on about what the point of treatment was, or what the clinic philosophy was or practice was. So all of these things ethnographers are paying attention to. I also, because of my role as a clinical trainee, I also had access to certain material sources like patient charts, which again, I got permission from patients to have access to those. But even without that, as a clinical trainee, you technically already have that kind of access. But I did obtain an additional consent from clients that would allow me to do that. So I had access to all of their charts, certainly to promotional materials from the clinic, any guidebooks or handbooks they had, treatment plans, client treatment plans, training documents, all the plans from the insurance companies, policies from local, state, and federal agencies. and sources of local knowledge, that, how people, what people referred to as they were justifying their decisions for what they did. So this could be anything from, I watched, I had a class in my psychology program that told me this, that, or the other thing about eating disorders, or I watched this documentary, or, whatever the case may be. So I also did a bunch of interviews. So I conducted about 80 formal interviews, which is the kind of sit down, face-to-face, tape record, an hour or so long interview. And that was with clients, clinicians, family members. And I also did, hundreds of informal interviews. So as we're, in the flow of everyday life, having a conversation with someone in a more informal way. So I also had all of that information, and that was all transcribed and coded for the research as well. So I was able to ask, each of the people that participated in these interviews about their own experience with an eating disorder, if they were a client, and how they felt about treatment, what kinds of things they found helpful or not helpful, with the clinicians to understand their experiences of working in this field, what their frustrations and challenges were, why they still remained motivated to do it, even in a challenging situation. So all of those kinds of questions I was able to ask in these qualitative interviews. So I was really propelled forward by these key questions. These really motivated me in my research. And so the first one is, why does treatment so often fail? We have been doing this for a long time, treating eating disorders. We've known about them and been treating them for decades. And we have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of resources in the United States. So why is it still the case that about half of the people who receive treatment for an eating disorder don't get well? Why is that the case? How is that possible? And within that, I was very interested in, what are the leverage points for change? How can we change this situation? How can we improve these outcomes and these possibilities for recovery? So those key questions took me to even deeper questions, and kind of three different categories of them. So the first one is, how do we understand what eating disorders even are, and who's at risk for them? So in order to understand the contemporary situation, it was really important for me to understand the evolution of the diagnosis of different eating disorders over time. And they have emerged and changed over time, and they continue to change. So this required a kind of deep dive into the history of psychiatry and psychiatric practice. And we can really trace the origins of beliefs and attitudes about eating disorders all the way back to the concept of hysteria that was prevalent in the very early days of psychiatry. And hysteria was a kind of catch-all umbrella term that covered a lot of different things that have since been broken up into different diagnoses. So in the current clinical atmosphere, we do not talk about hysteria. It is a discredited diagnosis. We have not used it for decades. It is usually viewed very disparagingly as something that's like, those Victorians had those silly ideas about hysteria. But when we really look at the history and we see how things like anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa, things like borderline personality or histrionic personality, like all of these are somatoform disorders, that we have these diagnoses now that don't use the word hysteria, but are really derived from that original set of concepts and ideas. And so even though the language has gotten very far from hysteria as a diagnosis, these different current diagnoses carry the legacy and some of the implicit assumptions of these earlier views. So I'll say more about that in a minute. The second set of questions is, how do we understand what good treatment is and what recovery looks like? these are big questions. If we're all about recovery and we're trying to measure how many people are able to get to recovery through the course of treatment, we need to talk about what does recovery look like. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of different definitions out there about what recovery is. Is it the abatement of certain symptoms that you can measure according to standardized measures? Is it an improvement in quality of life? And what does that mean for somebody? There's a lot of different ways of defining recovery that we need to explore and talk about before we can, understand the current situation. And then, of course, what is treatment? What does treatment consist of? What makes it good versus not good? So these another set of questions around those issues. And then the final one that is really particular to the United States context is how have these changed under the conditions of managed care? So I'm going to tell you a bit about what managed care is in the United States setting. So managed care is a structure of insurance provision that gained prominence in the 1990s. Prior to that, there were private insurance companies, doctors, and patients. And doctors would make decisions about what kind of treatment they thought their patients needed. They would bill the insurance companies. The insurance companies would pay for those treatments, right? There got to be a lot of concern about potential waste happening in this arena, and concern that some physicians, maybe a lot of them, were overcharging insurance for procedures or tests or interventions that were perhaps not really needed. And what that did for clients who had, a certain number, limits on their insurance coverage is it could potentially use up all of their insurance benefits for a very costly set of tests or interventions that maybe they didn't really need, but paid the doctor very well. And then the patient is left without money to be able to get the interventions that they actually need. So this was the concern. There was a lot of concern that this was perhaps happening. And I guess there was evidence that, it was. I don't know exactly how widespread it was, but that was the narrative. And so the idea was that managed care companies would become sort of middlemen or brokers in the situation. And originally they were started as not-for-profit entities. And their job was to kind of be the arbiter. If a physician said, I believe that this patient needs this test or this intervention for this condition, the managed care companies were the ones who would kind of look at all the evidence and decide whether this was the appropriate use of that patient's insurance dollars, or whether, something that was less invasive or a lower level test or a different kind of intervention that costs less money might be more appropriate, right? So that's all great. However, later on in the 90s, there were changes to federal policy in the United States. And managed care companies first were allowed to become for-profit enterprises. And second, they were allowed to become providers of insurance themselves. So instead of being a middleman or a broker between a private insurance company, a physician, and a client, the managed care companies, the ones who are deciding what are legitimate interventions to approve, they are now the ones who are providing the insurance and are authorized to make a profit. So there's a massive conflict of interest where for any insurance company, including a managed care company, the way they make money is they take in insurance premiums and they strive to take in more in premiums than they approve in expenditures, right? So as a managed care company, you are motivated to deny more care, right? Or if profit is your motive, then you are going to be very, very stingy with what you're going to approve, because each healthcare dollar that you spend is coming out of your bottom line, right? So this is a kind of perfect storm situation that has set up a set of issues. So in this insurance company framework, it is really important to authorize treatment for patients that they believe are going to follow doctor recommendations and who can get well and will get well quickly, right? That's how they're going to make the most money. Now, under this rationale, eating disorders are very expensive conditions to treat. And this is true. that eating disorders are more expensive to treat than a lot of other conditions, particularly mental health conditions, because they require a multidisciplinary team. You need to have a psychiatrist, a physician, a dietitian, a therapist. You might have to have other people on board depending on what kind of medical complications might be going on. So they are expensive to treat. And if somebody needs inpatient treatment for any length of time, that just kind of racks up the dollars, right? So there's that component. And then, insurance companies have access to the same statistics everybody else does. And so they see that even with treatment, about 50% of the time, people relapse or even become chronic or even die. So from this for-profit insurance company rationale, it makes sense that they're thinking, why should we spend money on eating disorder treatment if it doesn't work? It's expensive and it doesn't work. So it's very difficult. They are very reluctant to release treatment dollars for eating disorders. So this is in particular, they're reluctant across the board, but in particular for eating disorders, they see it as a very, very bad investment. So this, of course, begs the question, why is it that so many clients fail to get well in terms of eating disorders? And the general perception and the lore in the clinical space and in the insurance space is that eating disorder clients, more so than other kinds of patients, are just difficult. They're going to push back against limits. They're going to be sneaky. They're not going to be truthful. They're going to resist treatment. They just don't want to get better. This is the perception. And so from an insurance company standpoint, it's like, okay, this treatment is expensive. It doesn't have good outcomes. And the reason it doesn't have good outcomes is because the patients themselves don't want to get better. So why on earth would we approve treatment money for these folks, right? But in my research, I found that these are not the main reasons why clients often fail to get well. It is true that some eating disorder patients are what might be termed difficult. They might resist treatment. They might not want to get better. This is all part and parcel of the illness that they are contending with. And we should not expect anything different when people are coming into treatment for that very condition, that those elements might show up in the treatment context, right? But regardless, that is not the main reason why so many clients fail to get well. And what I really, discovered is that the consequences of the managed care model on eating disorder treatment has set up a situation that makes it extremely difficult for people to recover within the care system. So to start with, only 3% of health plans cover anorexia according to best practice guidelines. So in the United States, we have the American Psychological Association that makes practice guidelines and medical standards for what kinds of treatment should be provided with what kinds of symptomatology. So for example, for anorexia nervosa, it is usually, if somebody reaches 85% of their ideal body weight, that is considered to indicate medical necessity for inpatient treatment, right? So that is the standard of care. However, insurance plans, these managed healthcare plans, do not have to follow those recommendations. They can make up their own, and they do make up their own. And so it may be, for example, that a managed care company says, 85%. No, we think that somebody should have to be 80% of their ideal body weight before we will approve inpatient treatment. So they're able to kind of game the system in order to reduce the amount of dollars that they're spending on people's treatment, right? So only about 3% of health plans cover anorexia nervosa according to these guidelines. And in general, with eating disorders, the length of treatment is much lower than the recommended standards of care. And many insurance policies provide really limited benefits for eating disorder treatment. Like they might only allow, if you have mental health benefits for 120 days per year, they might only allow you to use 30 of those for eating disorder treatment, for example. Or they may even exclude eating disorders from coverage altogether and just say, it's too expensive for us to treat. We are just not going to include it in our plan. And then if that's your insurance coverage, you are out of luck. You just do not have coverage for an eating disorder. And the consequences of this are really profound. 1 in 5 eating disorder specialists believe that insurance companies are indirectly responsible for the death of at least one of their patients. So that's 1 in 5. I actually think that number is too low. I think it is higher now. I think that is just from my experience with my research and talking to people. I haven't done an extensive survey, but every single eating disorder clinician I have ever spoken to has mentioned managed care and how dangerous it is because they don't follow the medical guidelines and it puts people at risk. And 96.7% of providers, according to this study, believe that their patients with anorexia are put in life-threatening situations because the insurance companies refuse to cover their treatment. So this is really, life-threatening stuff, and it's being made by a for-profit set of companies that are looking out for their bottom line. So what does this mean in terms of everyday practice in the clinic? Well, one of the things it means is that because insurance companies are so skeptical of eating disorder patients and so reluctant to pay for eating disorder treatment, they require patients to continually prove that they are sick enough to warrant care. And this is really problematic for eating disorders in particular, because what it sets up is a situation that replicates and reinforces the dynamics of rationing, restricting, and withholding that treatment is supposed to be helping people overcome. So in other words, these clients are steeped into this clinical situation where they're being scrutinized at every move to discover the truth of whether or not they are good patients, whether or not they are doing what they're supposed to do to get well, and whether or not insurance thinks they are still worthy of investment. And this is incredibly problematic because what it means is everybody in the clinic, the clients as well as the clinicians, are constantly hypervigilant about, is insurance going to continue to approve this treatment, or are they going to just yank coverage at any moment, which they can do. If they decide that a person is not abiding by the treatment rules or is not improving in the recovery, they can just stop paying for treatment. So what it does is it replicates a lot of the dynamics of the eating disorder itself, where there's usually a focus on, being very controlling and restricting about when one can eat and what one can do, and a lot of concern about am I worthy of food? Am I worthy of taking up space? Am I worthy of attention? Am I worthy of any kind of care at all? And a lot of times eating disorders really emerge out of a sense of not feeling worthy of any of those things. So then you're put in a clinical situation that's supposed to be helping you overcome this eating disorder, when really it's just replaying the exact dynamics that are at the foundation of the disorder to start with. And so when patients, quote unquote, fail to overcome the kinds of double binds that are built into the system, this is then, something that insurance companies use to further justify not giving them care. So I'm going to give you an illustration of 3 cases to show what this actually looks like in practice. So the first one is a client that I call Hope. And Hope was 13 years old at the time that she was at the clinic at Cedar Grove. She was the youngest client that I'd ever seen go through there. And she was there for, she was struggling with anorexia nervosa. And she had come to the clinic, with a nasogastric tube. So she was on tube feeding. She was really struggling to even eat regular food, let alone anything else. And they worked with her for, quite a while. She was able to get the tube out. She was able to start, eating her meals, but it was definitely a struggle. But she was, slowly making progress. She got to, about 83-84% of her ideal body weight, which is fantastic. It's still under that medical necessity. She still needed to be inpatient, but she was getting better. But her insurance coverage was running out. She only had a certain number of days that she was able to use, and it was running out. So the staff at the clinic were trying to find alternatives for Hope. And the family did not have any additional resources to pay for private therapy or any kind of, dietitian support or anything like that. And so they searched around and they found that at a local university, they were running a randomized controlled trial of an intervention for adolescents with anorexia. And that if Hope were able to get into this trial, there was a 50-50 chance that she would be randomized into the group that received this therapy intervention. The control group received dietitian support, but no therapy. So they figured, okay, if she gets randomized into one of these two groups, she'd at least be better off than having nothing at all, right? Now, the trick was that for this particular randomized controlled trial, in order to be enrolled in the study, you needed to be at 80% ideal body weight. And Hope was higher than that. She had come in much lower, but she was higher than that now. And so in order to help Hope become eligible for the study, the clinicians had a really tough decision to make about, do we celebrate the gains that she's made, discharge her still below where she needs to be, but hope for the best? Or do we do everything we can to try to get her enrolled in this study where she has a chance, she has a chance of getting a full-on therapy treatment, or at the very least dietitian support, which is better than nothing. But in order to do that, she would have to lose weight. So the clinicians very reluctantly decided that they would help her lose weight so that she would be eligible for this treatment study. So they put this young girl struggling with anorexia on a diet inside the eating disorder treatment center so she could lose enough weight to be enrolled in the study and have some chance of getting help outside of the clinic. I don't know ultimately what happened with Hope. I wish I did. I very much hope that, she did get the treatment she needs. But that's the kind of clinical conundrum, this ethical dilemma that patients and clinicians are put in all the time because of managed care situations and other kinds of research constraints that, sometimes you have to do something you think is ethically really problematic if it's going to provide the best possibility for our client to actually get extended treatment. The second example is a woman named Haley. She was 28 years old when she came into treatment at Cedar Grove. She had a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa, and she had been struggling with anorexia for about 10 years. And prior to coming into the treatment center, she had been subsisting on a diet of nothing but zucchini for 2 full years. She would sleep all day. She would get up at 2 a.m. She would cook 6 to 8 zucchini sliced up. She would kind of cook them on her stovetop, and that's what she would eat between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. And that was all she ate for 2 years. It ruled her life. She had to drop out of school. She was not going to work anymore. She, had amenorrhea, so she had lost her menstruation. She had severe osteoporosis by the time she came into treatment because she was not getting nourished. So when she came to Cedar Grove, a big part of the treatment was simply getting her regulated, right? She was sleeping all day and up from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. at night. And so that is, not going to work when you're in a treatment center. So there was a lot of work on kind of getting her sleep-wake schedule corrected and then introducing new foods to her because she'd been eating nothing but zucchini for 2 years. Well, as can sometimes happen when somebody is really malnourished and they start to eat regular food, she developed what is called refeeding syndrome, which involves a bunch of different things, but the most obvious of which is extreme edema or swelling. So people's bodies swell through water retention. That your body retains a lot of water, and it can be painful, and because the skin can kind of feel stretchy and it's painful, and your body swells, and people gain a lot of water weight in this process because their body's holding on to all this water. So Kaylee's weight started to go up very quickly in treatment, which was very alarming for her, understandably. She understood that it was water weight, but nevertheless, it's alarming. It was concerning for the clinicians as well. But she was also getting nourished. It wasn't all water weight. She was getting nourished. She was eating, more food that nourished her body. And after a couple of weeks, she got her period, which she had not had in many years. So the clinicians were very happy about this because they saw this as an indicator that underneath all the water weight and whatnot, like her body was actually healing itself. Kaylee found this very distressing because it indicated to her that it was not all water weight and that she was actually gaining, real weight, and her body was transforming. The insurance company was thrilled because they were already celebrating her weight gain, even though it was purely water weight. It didn't really matter to them. They were tracking the weight gain. They were very happy about that. And once she got her period back, they thought, wonderful, this is exactly the sign we were waiting for. She is recovered. She's at her ideal body weight, which again was mostly water weight, but they didn't care. She's at her ideal body weight. She's menstruating. Fabulous. She's done. She's recovered. We're going to discharge her. So Kaylee and the clinicians, of course, all knew that this was going to be a disaster. She was barely medically regulated, let alone working on any of the stuff that was driving her eating disorder to start with. But her insurance company, looking for the quickest way to get her out of this expensive treatment, said, nope, weight on the scale says X, and she has her period, so that's good enough for us. So they discharged her. Within 2 weeks, not a surprise to anybody, Kaylee was in full relapse. I don't even know if we can call it a relapse because I don't think she was ever in recovery. She hadn't had a chance to get there yet. But she was fully back in her eating disorder, and she called the clinic for help. She desperately wanted to come back and to continue her treatment. And her insurance company denied her treatment request because they said, since she had relapsed into her eating disorder when she was discharged, that meant that she had failed her care. She failed her treatment, and they were not going to authorize further treatment for someone who had failed it the first time. So the third case I want to tell you about is a woman named Anita. So I had worked with Anita earlier on in my time at Cedar Grove, and then she was, she left against medical advice at that point, and she was away for probably 6 to 8 months. And then I came in one day, and she was there again, and she was sitting on the couch in the common room, and she looked at me, and her eyes were just like very tearful, and she said, Rebecca, I'm so sorry I relapsed. Like, I tried really hard. I tried to beat this thing, and I relapsed, and I'm really sorry. She said thought I was going to be mad at her because I was her therapist, and that I would be disappointed or something. So of course I reassured her that I was not disappointed, and I was really glad she was back in treatment, and we're gonna continue working to help her get well. But it's quite shocking to see her because she was quite a bit at a much lower weight than she had been the first time. So she really was in the depths of it. So later on that day, I was in the staff area of the clinic, and I was talking to one of the nurses about seeing Anita back again and how I felt concerned for her and her well-being. And the nurse, to my surprise, kind of let out a snort and rolled her eyes at me. And she said, oh, please, don't you see what she was doing? She was totally manipulating you. She was trying to get you to feel sorry for her because she's so sick. You cannot validate that. It is exactly what she wants. So I found this comment really perplexing at the time. Like, it caught me off guard and it disturbed me, and it took me a while to kind of process through it and really think through what I had heard and why it was, what that was all about. And the more I thought about it, the thornier the issue appeared. So there was no question that Anita was literally deathly ill. That's why she was back at the clinic. But this nurse maintained that the fact that Anita wanted or needed acknowledgement of her suffering from me, and that she seemed to solicit it so directly by calling attention to the fact that she relapsed and that she was struggling. The nurse saw that as part of the same illness. So to her, Anita explicitly asking for me to recognize her suffering was a manipulative ploy. And that the only appropriate clinical response to that would be to not acknowledge Anita's suffering. Because if I acknowledge it, I'm kind of feeding into this like, oh, you poor thing, you're so sick, we're going to take care of you sort of thing. This is what the nurse's thought was. In my mind, if somebody, and this goes across the board, including Anita, but if somebody has to get to the state of being literally deathly ill to get somebody to acknowledge that they are suffering, then it is imperative that we acknowledge that they are suffering. This is not the same thing as playing into somebody inhabiting a sick role. It's not the same as being manipulated. It is acknowledging the reality of what is in front of us. And the idea that ignoring patient suffering is the way to provide appropriate care is something that, is part of this bigger picture that I've been painting about the perception of eating disorder clients as being so difficult and manipulative, and that you have to be extremely careful with whatever you give them, whether it's insurance dollars, whether it's clinical attention, whether it's empathy, whatever, that you have to be withholding and restrictive in what you give to them specifically because they want it, right? So this is a very screwy, difficult dynamic. So what can we learn from these three cases? We learn a lot of things, but the main thing is what I was just talking about, that providing appropriate care in this for-profit managed care system that is treating an illness that still contains the legacies of hysteria and a lot of the gendered and misogynistic assumptions that are baked into that diagnosis. Bringing all this together produces a situation in which clinical care for eating disorders is supposed to be, or at least, we're trained that best practices are to actually withhold care from these clients. That otherwise we are giving into them, that we are being manipulated. It posits this kind of power struggle between the providers and the client that is like one of us is going to win, right? And this is extraordinarily problematic for all sorts of reasons that I think are readily apparent. But even more so, when we think about, what are often the underlying driving factors that leads somebody to an eating disorder in the first place. It's feeling like I'm not seen, I'm not heard, people don't take me seriously, nobody's listening to me. And so that just gets embedded and replicated in our treatment systems because of these structures that we live under. So what happens, it's not just the clients that suffer. It's, clinicians are caught also in these contradictory ethical systems. They they certainly have their own biases based on their training and their experience and whatnot. But for the most part, the clinicians that I worked with, were genuinely good people who really wanted to help their clients. They really genuinely wanted to do well by their clients. And they thought by withholding their empathy or withholding, acknowledgement of suffering, all that kind of stuff, that they were doing what was good for them. That was their perception, that this was helping them. So it wasn't from a desire to hurt anybody. But they did, they found themselves caught in these ethical dilemmas between, if I respond to the client in a way that I think might be most appropriate, the insurance company is going to get mad, or that's going to be, not what I learned in school is the appropriate way to interact with somebody who's dealing with this situation. So they're really caught between, how do I deal with the clinical reality that I see in front of me? How am I responsive and a responsible clinician at the same time that I am kind of completely immersed in the system that's telling me to withhold, and restrict? So this makes it very difficult for clinicians to navigate everyday practice in the clinic. Of course, for clients, this is also extraordinarily difficult. They have to perform a certain kind of sick self, but if they do, they risk being seen as manipulative or difficult. And care, of course, gets reconfigured from provision, attention, palliation to something that is about withdrawing, withholding, deprivation, restriction. And it just reinforces all these core elements of an eating disorder, that the person is not sick enough, they don't deserve health or comfort, they don't deserve care, they don't deserve attention, their body is their referendum on their moral self. And so, despite clinicians' good intentions, eating disorder treatment recreates and legitimizes these patterns of restriction, withholding, and moral evaluation, and this hyper-focus on the body that clients are supposed to let go of. And so when we steep clients in this system, and then we send them out on their own long before they're well, it's really no wonder that they don't get better or they relapse. And when this happens, conventional wisdom and practice is that the client is the one who gets blamed for not wanting to get better, not the system or the structures of care. And so this is what I call ethical offloading. It's just offloading all of this morass of situation onto individual clients, like Allison, who I talked about in the beginning, who died of her eating disorder, and blaming clients for not wanting to get well. So returning to the question, the issue that I started with about what's the story behind the story? Why is it that, with such a widespread population of people who struggle with these conditions, with the research and knowledge that we do have, with the resources that we have, what is the story behind the story? Why are we still in a situation where almost half of the people who actually do receive specialized eating disorder care in the United States still don't get well? So what's the story behind that story? So, of course, a big part of it is that people are not getting not enough of the right kinds of care for the right amount of time. They're simply just not getting enough of what they need. But it's more than that. We don't just need to give more care as usual. That is not the answer, because the system within which this is unfolding is broken and is reinforcing the issues that undergird the eating disorder itself. And so ultimately, my research shows that eating disorder clients do not fail treatment. Eating disorder treatment fails clients. And this is a really important distinction and is a kind of perspective shift in how we think about these conditions and how to treat them. So just to wrap up, where do we go from here? In Famished, in my book, I identify a number of different steps that we can take, and I'll just give a kind of high-level view here. We need to change the language and how we talk about these conditions. There is still this perception that it is a tiny percentage of people, or that it's mostly rich, white teenagers who are trying to look like Instagram influencers or whatever, and it trivializes it and makes eating disorders into something that's about vanity and trying to get attention, and that is not what they are. So we need to change the language about it. We need to talk about them as a public health crisis, and we need to talk about coverage for treatment and research as an issue of equity. It is an equity issue. We also need to improve our education around these conditions. Physicians desperately need extensive training in eating disorders. They don't get it. And so the frontline clinicians like pediatricians and general practitioners, the training that they get on eating disorders in the course of their regular medical training might be half a day, if that. So unless they choose to pursue specialized training, which costs money and you have to seek it out, they're not educated in how to spot the signs and what to do or how to respond. In terms of research, we need a lot more discussion and clarity around what are our outcomes and what are we measuring and how we're evaluating things. And in terms of treatment, of course, we need to improve access to care. Right now, it's cost prohibitive unless you have insurance. And then as we've seen with insurance, that brings its own set of barriers. And we also need better continuity of care outside of these inpatient treatment centers where people can receive other kinds of support once they have made it through the inpatient care, or if they don't need that level of care to start with. So hopefully with, what I was trying to get at with my book and hopefully in this talk is to give some insight, not only into eating disorders, but also the conditions in the United States, at least, that produce them, that enable them, and even require them to thrive. So the ways in which our entire structure of how we think about health and wellness, how we think about good care, how we think about who's worthy of investment and treatment, just replicates all of the thinking and experiences that undergird the conditions that we're trying to help people heal from. So if you want to learn more about that and, a lot more detail, you can pick up my book, Famished, or, I think it's available on a couple of sites for free. So, by all means, search that out. And I hope that this has been an informative discussion for you. I thank you so much for your attention, and please feel free to reach out to me by email or on X or Instagram or wherever, or my website. If you have any other questions or would like to get some feedback, I would really appreciate it. So thank you all so much for your attention. Take care.
안녕하세요. 소은님. 감사 인사 좀 전해주세요. 너무 잘 들었습니다.
Hi, Rebecca. My name's Sarah. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us from early in the morning from the States. Thank you so much for the session. Yeah, Jeannie, unfortunately, she can't open her camera because her laptop's quite old. So yeah, just FYI. But I'll be having interpretation today.
Great. Hi. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you all.
그러면 어떻게 할까요? 지금 사람들이 질문거리 생각할 시간이 필요해서 한 3, 4분 정도 있다가 질의응답을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 너무 감사드려요. 이 새벽에.
Because we just finished, I think people probably would want to write up some questions. So we'll give about 34 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
교수님 안녕하세요. 김관욱 교수님 카메라 켜셨네요.
네, 안녕하세요.
레베카 교수님을 영접하시려 카메라를 켜시고 접속을 하셨습니다. 레베카 교수님께 지금 잠깐 소개해드릴까요? 김광욱 교수님, 의료인류학 교수님이고 이미 페미시스트 다 읽어보셨고 관심 많으시다고 좀.
제가 직접 해도 되는데.
진짜요? 소원님 잠깐 소개 좀 해드려도 돼요?
네, 제가 소개드리고 넘겨드리겠습니다. So Rebecca here joining us today is Professor Kwanuk Kim. He is a professor in medical anthropology. So he also has read Famished. I was really impressed by your lecture today. So yeah, I'd like to introduce you to introduce him to you.
Very nice to meet you.
Hi, Rebecca. It's a big honor for me to listen to your lecture.
Thank you.
And I'm leading the medical Psychology Research Group in Korea, and my former how can I say? I trained by Hyun Lee.
Oh, yes.
Yes, and she mentioned you are the one of the supervisor for her PhD.
Yes.
And we studied your book, Femicide, together, and particularly mentioned about the theory of affect, you using the theory of affect, and particularly to me, interesting sentence was, fat is not feeling. It's quite impressive because in Korea, there are a lot of ambivalent feeling amongst young people because I'm teaching at Women's University and many of the 20s women, female students, they're struggling with more or less eating disorder in their daily life. So I do love to introduce your book to my students, and it's a really honor to see you and have a chance to ask some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I haven't talked to, we knew her as Kate Lee. I haven't talked to her in quite a while, but she's just amazing.
Right, great. 지민님 질문하실 수 있는 분들이 질문하시면.
어디 보자. 여러분들 질문하실 거 있으면 채팅창에 써주셔도 되고요. 아니면 말씀으로 해주셔도 되고 여기서 소호님이 계속 도와주실 거예요. 교수님 먼저 질문하셔도 괜찮겠어요. 아직 쓰신 분 없으니까. 잠깐만요. 이분들이 쉬시려고 잠깐 나가신 분들이 계시네. 잠깐만요. 기다렸다가 해야 될까요? 어디 보자.
그러면 소원님한테 다들 어쨌든 이게 한국 분들이 참여하고 계시니까 제가 한글로 질문을 드린 걸 좀 대신 물어보시면.
네네네. 써주세요.
말로 하면 안 될까요?
말로 말씀하셔도 돼요.
네. 질문을 그러면 먼저 드리면, 미국에서 강연에서 이야기한 것처럼, 이팅 디스오더 환자가 3천만 명에 이른다고 하는데, 그리고 그것이 치명률이 굉장히 높은 질병으로 소개하고 있는데, 실제 미국 분들이 이것을 그렇게 심각하게 받아들이고 있는지, 저도 그 수치를 듣고 꽤나 충격을 받았고, 그리고 62분마다 한 명씩 이팅 디스오더로 사망한다는 것도 굉장히 큰 충격이었습니다. 그런 이야기들이 실제 미국 사람들한테 얼마만큼 현실적인 문제로 받아들여지고 있는지 피부에 와닿지가 않습니다. 그 부분이 실제 연구자나 치료자들 말고도 일반 대중들한테도 일상적으로 큰 문제로 인식되고 있는지 좀 질문하고 싶습니다.
So, hi, Rebecca. We'll start with some questions. It was from Professor Kim himself. So he was quite shocked the fact that there's about 3 million patients with eating disorders, if that's correct. And it comes with a very high mortality rate. So in the United States, except, besides from researchers and people who have experience with eating disorders, what is the public's response to eating disorders and what is the current awareness of it?
That's a really important question. People are aware that they exist, certainly. Surprisingly to me, as somebody who works in this area, there's not a lot of public kind of urgency around it. They're still seen as, something that only affects a certain group of people. They're still, like I said in my talk, really viewed as kind of all about appearance. And so they're trivialized a lot. I mean, people recognize that they can be deadly, but as far as the motivations or, what can get somebody stuck in an illness like that, there's just not a lot of sensitivity to the depths of the problem. So people still tend to kind of attribute it to the individual, as this is like an individual issue, whether, regardless of what the eating disorder is. There's more recognition of binge eating disorder now that it's in the DSM, but that's still really viewed primarily as an individual issue, whether it's a psychological issue or a medical issue, that now we have these new medications that, help, treat some of the symptoms, but that doesn't get to the underlying issues. So they're still pretty marginalized.
네, 우선 레베카 선생님께서 말씀해 주신 거를 토대로 보면, 어느 정도의 인식은 지금 사회에 있기는 하지만 뭔가 이 대중들의 되게 심각성에 대해서 아직 잘 알려지지 않은 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그리고 특히나 이 섭식장애가 개인의 영역이라는 거에 대해서 강조가 되어 있고, 그냥 생김새, 외모 이런 거에 대한 연관성이 있지, 이게 뭔가 사회 문맥 안에서 이 심각한 질병이라는 거에 대한 이해 조금 적은 것 같다고 말씀을 주셨고, 특히 최근에 이제 폭식증에 대해서는 조금 더 이제 인식도가 높아진 것 같다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. So, yep. The next.
소호님 자신의
네.
개인의 질문 들어가겠습니다.
Hi, Rebecca. So it's actually a question from myself. So I also currently work in healthcare, and especially the last part about Haley's story really was impressive, and it made me think a lot about how systems can fail individuals. So I think it's very clear that those certain type of patients are in a gray zone when it comes to accessing healthcare and with health insurance. But I think from a health insurance perspective, it's a very difficult to put a price on these, and unfortunately they have to make money out of it, which is the reality. So I wanted to know, what is the current prevailing argument for representing patients like Haley that could be used to persuade insurance that these patients need. So one example that I heard before was that a lot of patients in their 20s with eating disorders tend to be also highly intelligent. And if these patients are away from the system, it's also a loss economically because their economic power is lost. So I just wanted to know what is a strong argument against that we can make to represent these patients to the insurance companies that they do need to invest in these treatments.
That's a fantastic question. And yes, I think part of the strategy has to be speaking the language that they understand, the insurance companies, right? Which, they are for-profit businesses. That is what they're intended to be. So, what you said is one angle in terms of lost productivity and lost, social benefit from these people who are, by and large, extremely intelligent, talented, driven, have a lot of really wonderful qualities, but are kind of taken out of the system when they're struggling. So that's one argument. Another argument is to look at the kind of longer term health costs of not addressing an eating disorder the first time that it comes around. Because what happens is the insurance companies tend to think of eating disorders as not so much a chronic or long-standing condition, but as these episodes of acuity, right? So somebody comes into treatment with this, episode of acuity, they get them back to a weight that seems to be healthy for their height. And then the insurance companies are like, great, they're better, we can discharge them and we'll move along, without kind of taking into account that that person's going to more than likely come back and need more treatment, whether it's from an eating disorder treatment center, an emergency room, a cardiologist, whatever the case may be. So I think that's another angle to make the argument with the insurance companies.
Has it been working? Just as a follow-up question.
I haven't seen a lot of work on it, which is really surprising to me. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but I haven't seen much lately. I think somebody needs to do like a really large scale review of the economic data and to make that argument. Yeah.
Thank you. 네, 그래서 레베카 교수님께서 이제 말씀 주신 답변을 알려드리겠습니다. 우선 저의 이제 질문 자체에 대해서는 말씀드리면, 어쨌든 헤일리라는 이제 환자 이야기 마지막에 있었고, 그 환자가 이제 보험제도의 사각지대에 있었기 때문에 어떠한 그 치료에 대한 이제 비용 지불이 굉장히 많아지고 그러한 이제 억울함을 겪게 됐는데 사실 보험사 입장에서도 어떻게 보면은 이제 그 환자 하나하나 다 일일이 이제 비용을 지불할 수 없다 보니까 이러한 상황에서 우리가 섭식장애 환자들을 위해서 어떠한 이제 논쟁을 이어나갈 수 있을까에 대해 제가 질문을 여쭤봤고요. 우선 두 가지 답변을 주셨는데 첫 번째 답변은 특히나 30대 이 섭식장애를 앓고 있는 이제 여성 환자들이 굉장히 지능이 높고 사실 사회 돌아갔을 때 이제 많은 기여를 할 수 있는 생산성에 대한 이제 논쟁을 할 수 있다고 말씀 주셨습니다. 그래서 결국 이 환자들을 돌보지 않는다는 것 자체가 어떠한 나라 국가의 경제적 손실과도 연관될 수 있다라는 어떤 논쟁을 우리가 얼규멘트를 지어 나올 수 있을 거라 말씀 주셨고 두 번째 같은 경우에 특히 보험사에서 이제 바라보는 하고 이해하고 있는 섭식장애는 어, 이게 장기간적으로 이제 오랫동안 지속되는 질병에 대한 이해가 아니라 그냥 단기적으로 에피소드씩 있는 이제 질병으로 이해한다고 합니다. 그래서 사실 이 섭식장애라는 거는 한 개인이 오랫동안 이제 앓고 있는 질병이다 보니까 그런 전반적인 비용 측면에서 훨씬 더 지출이 더 많다라는 거를 조금 강조를 하다 보면 우리가 섭식장애 환자를 위해서 이제 비용에 대한 부분을 조금 해소할 수 있지 않을까 정도로 말씀해 주셨습니다.
근데 말씀해 주신 첫 번째 답변은 우리가 이미 안 된다는 거를
네.
우리나라에 먹히지 않는다는 거를 이미 한번 겪었는데 그 말씀 한번 해드릴까요? 그거? 그
아,
리프로덕션에
네.
관심이 있는 사회에 대해서.
So, so Jeannie's follow-up comment on the previous question that I asked was with the first part on women's economic productivity. I think those angles have been there were some attempts to have start those discussions with government bodies, but I don't know if you're aware, but Korea has a very low fertility rate and birth rate at the moment. And so government's biggest interest is they want to make connections of the narratives of birth rate. So instead of thinking of the need for redemption of eating disorder patients is not because of economic power, because of it's a society's loss of not having more babies. So that's a very tricky position that we're in because that's very discriminatory inherently.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just wanted to highlight and kind of add on that comment. And I also wanted to know what you think about that as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I can certainly understand the motivation for making that link as a way to persuade lawmakers or insurance companies or however the structure is there. But yeah, it is also tricky in terms of like a woman's body is only valuable to the extent that it's producing children or assuming that people, that these women want to have children. There's a lot of assumptions there, but I completely understand that using that as a leverage. So that makes sense.
Yeah. We have another question.
답 좀 해석해 주세요.
교수님께서 해주신 말씀은 그 관점도 어느 정도 이해는 된다고 말씀해 주셨고 좀 굉장히 어려운 문제인 것 같다라고 정리될 것 같습니다. 네, 왜 국가가 이제 그거를 레버리지 하고 싶어 하는지도 이제 이해는 할 수 있을 것 같지만 어쨌든 한 여성의 몸에 대한 이제 결정은 개인이 하는 거기 때문에 굉장히 어려운 문제일 것 같다라고 말씀 주셨습니다.
관욱 교수님이 긴 질문을 하나 더 주셨어요.
네, 혹시
소님,
네,
네.
진익이 읽어줄 수 있으실까요?
읽어드릴까요? 네.
네.
한국에서도 미국처럼 섭식장애를 문제로 인식하지 못하는 현상이 매우 더 강하죠. 사실은 더 강하죠. 그럼에도 청소년 여성 및 젊은 여성들 사이에서 살 빼는 약이 불법적으로 확산되고 프로아나에 대한 부정적 시각도 동시에 확산 중입니다. 그럼에도 이를 개인의 성적 문제로 치부하며 그 근원인 심리적 문제를 보려하지 않습니다. 페미시드라는 책에서 이를 테크놀로지 오브 프레젠싱이라고 설명했는데요. 존재, 현존의 기술 이렇게 설명을 했는데요. 섭식장애 당사자가 빅레어를 확인시키기 위한 그런 실존적 반응으로서 섭식장애가 발생한다고 말하고 있습니다. 이에 대해 좀 더 설명을 부탁드리고 이런 분석이 실제로 섭식장애에 대한 대중의 인식을 깊게 만드는데 학자로서 어느 정도 효과를 본다고 생각하고 있는지 궁금합니다. 이런 당신의 업적을 한국에도 소개하고 싶은 마음에 질문을 던집니다.
Yep, so
이 컨셉이 되게 중요하고 좀 더 이야기를 듣고 싶네요.
네. So the next question is also from Professor Kim. So the purpose of the question is to really share your research results to the wider audience in Korea. So kind of bear in mind that that's the purpose of the question. So in Korea, it's similar to the US and even more, eating disorder isn't really perceived as a societal issue. And there's a lot of communities online with Pro Ana, and also a lot of medications for like diet pills are still highly in demand amongst these women of that age group. And it's often that the society kind of makes it that this is more of an individual's issue related to their personality instead of a systematic issue. So in your book, in Famished, you talk about the technology of presencing and also the concept of being there and existential response. So Professor Kim wanted to know if you can expand more on that, those of the concepts in relation to perhaps societal awareness of eating disorders and how we can really alter how the mass understands eating disorder.
Sure, and I think that's gets to another critical question, which is how do we translate our research into something that is, widely understandable, not that people can't understand, but we want to make it easy for them to understand what we're trying to say, right? So I think that the idea of a technology of presence, and I want to acknowledge also that I was writing definitely from within a US context, and that this may look very different in other parts of the world. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind as well. But the idea with it is to try to capture some of the deeper existential issues that I think are really at the heart of what's going on. That this is not just about, wanting to fit into a size 0 jeans or, whatever the case may be. That's what it looks like, certainly to the outside, but the issues are far deeper and really have to do with how at least with the people that I worked with, how somebody experiences themselves as alive in the world and what that means. And that is not just an individual issue. I mean, of course, there's a lot of individual aspects to it, but we learn who we are and how to be in the world by the kinds of reflections we're getting from the people around us. So this is why I think it's really important to try to highlight that it's not like every person who develops an eating disorder independently comes up with these ideas about thinness or self-discipline or, whatever the case may be. Like, we're getting that from the culture that surrounds us. And so I think that would be the main message I think I would really want to try to communicate to the wider population, is that, maybe starting there, like, this is not an individual psychological, thing that happens in somebody's brain. It's a much more complex thing that has to do with all of us. It implicates all of us and how we see each other. And so I think that would probably be part of where I'd start. It's hard to translate that maybe into like actionable language for a policymaker or something like that. But I think getting that blame off the individual is a really important step.
Yeah, thank you. Just a follow-up question on that. Do you think the concept of choosing eating as a method to resolve those existential issues is quite arbitrary? Is that your argument? Could that be something else in relation to, let's say, drug use or substance use, for example?
I think there's definitely overlaps there. I think there's something really different and unique about eating, though, in part because it's the way that we literally take in the world, right? It's the way that we become nourished to exist in the world, which is different than something like alcohol or heroin or, something like that. It's also so social. It communicates so many things about nurturance and care in a way that other substances don't. So there's definitely overlap, but there's also really important differences.
Right. Thank you. So I'll translate. 우선 이제 김 교수님께서 이제 말씀 주신 아이디어 테크놀로지 프레젠스와 그다음에 existential response에 대해서 조금 추가적으로 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 우선 이 책을 이제 집필을 하셨을 때는 이제 미국 이제 사회 문학 맥락 속에서 적었다는 걸 조금 강조하고 싶다고 우선 서두에 말씀을 해 주셨고요. 레베카 교수님이 이제 하시는 말씀은 이 섭식장애라는 거가 이제 단순히 어느 한 개인이 그냥 되게 뭐 스몰 사이즈의 뭐 청바지를 입고 싶어서라는 그런 이슈를 좀 넘어서서 우리 어떤 존재에 대한 어떤 부분을 조금 한번 고민해 볼 수 있는 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 한 개인이 이 삶을 어떻게 경험하는가에 대한 관점을 조금 우리가 바라볼 필요가 있다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 그리고 이제 그거에 대한 또 중요하게 말씀하시는 거는 이게 개인의 영향이 아니라 굉장히 이제 콤플렉스하고 이제 복잡한 다양한 사회 맥락 속에서 발생하는 질병으로 이해했으면 좋겠다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 그렇게 복잡한 문제이기 때문에 이거를 우리가 이렇게 간단히 그 정책 차원에서 뭔가를 만드는 것 조금 어려움이 있다는 것도 조금 말씀을 해 주셨고요. 그리고 제가 이제 이 답변에 대해서 추가적으로 그러면은 이 섭식 장애가 다른 이제 중독, 예를 들어서 뭐 알코올 중독이라든지 아니면은 뭐 헤로인 중독과 어떤 차이가 있는지 이 당사자가 먹는다는 거를 정하는 것도 조금 랜덤한 부분이 있는지 질문을 드렸고 그거에 대한 답변은 사실 뭐 헤로인 같은 마약이나 알코올과는 다르게 이 섭식장애라는 거는 먹는다는 거는 우리 몸에 영양분을 주는 것, 그리고 우리 어떤 존재, 그리고 이제 삶과 굉장히 밀접하게 더 영향이 있고, 그리고 또 굉장히 사회적이고, 그다음에 이 생물학적인 근원이 있기 때문에 바라본 시각이 조금 다를 것 같다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 잘 전달되었길 바랍니다. 네.
저도 질문을 던지고 싶은데, 아까 서원님께 카톡으로 드리긴 했는데, 제가 이게 채팅창에 붙여지지가 않네요. 그래서 일단 저는 붙여주시겠어요? 제가 우리말로 말씀.
저도 제가 그 노트북에 카톡이 없어서
아,
붙여지지.
진짜? 이거 어떡하냐? 붙여지지가 않는다.
제가 읽고 있는데
아,
그러면은
네네.
제가,
읽어주시겠어요?
제가 그럼 영어로 질문하고 듣는 동안에 한국어로 적으실래요, 지니?
영어로 제가 먼저 한국어로 할게요. 한국어로 하고,
네.
그러면. 저는, 어, 우리나라도 의료 시스템 문제가 너무 크잖아요. 미국하고는 완전히 다른 형태지만, 그리고 결과적으로는 섭식장애 치료받을 수 있는 시설이 거의 없다고 보시면 되는 상태인데, 지금 문제가 우리나라는 비록 그 국가 건강보험이 있음에도 불구하고, 의료 서비스 제공자 자체는 95%가 프라이빗이라고 보면 되죠. 특히 정신과는 나머지 5%가 공공이라고 해도 그 공공의 주된 역할은 조현병이나 이런 심각한 질환 환자들을 입원시키는 거 외에 그게 중심이 되고 있고, 또 특히 섭식장애처럼 좀 새롭고 드문 질환 같은 경우는, 특히 또 건강보험으로 커버가 안 되는 경우는 개인 정신과 의사가 섭식장애 전문 병원을 개업하느냐 마느냐에 따라서 액세스가 달라져 버리는 거거든요. 이런 와중에 2000년대 초반에 섭식장애 전문 클리닉이 약간 개업 붐이 일었다고는 해도 그게 금방 꺼져 버렸고, 결국 2026년에는 그때보다 상황이 훨씬 더 안 좋아졌죠. 특히 섭식장애만 다루는 전문 입원 프로그램은 전국에 아무것도 없고요. 섭식장애 입원시킨다고 해도 지금은 일반 어 정신과 폐쇄병 등에 같이 입원시키는 것밖에 없고, 그래서 최악의 경우는 아주 어린 10대 소녀가 그런 정신과 병동에 입원하게 되고, 근데 그 안에서는 섭식장애에 대해서 제대로 알고 있는 스태프가 없는 실정에 그 아이는 제대로 케어를 못 받게 되고, 거기서 오히려 트라우마만 겪고 나오는 경우들이 많습니다. 그렇지만 그 결과에 대해서 누구도 책임을 지지 않죠. 그리고 레베카 교수님 말씀하신 것처럼 다 개인이나 가족의 책임으로 돌아가게 됩니다. 이 상황에 대해서 저는 말씀드리고 싶고, 교수님의 의견을 듣고 싶었어요.
So the next question is from Jeannie, Rebecca. So in Korea, the healthcare system is very much different to the US because it's a public healthcare system. But despite of that, 95% of practices are private and only 5% of practices are run by the government. Especially in psychiatry, it's more of an issue because there's very little space for the public sector. They're normally catered for severely considered illnesses like schizophrenia. So in that, what that means is if a patient wants to be hospitalized or need to be hospitalized for eating disorder, there's rarely any clinics that would specialize in eating disorders. there were some in the early 2000s, but nowadays it's very hard to find access for treatment specializing in eating disorders. So Jeannie wanted to ask and also share an anecdote of a 14-year-old girl with anorexia who has been hospitalized at a general psychiatric ward where the staff were overburdening her and training, or staff were already overburdened and were not professionally trained for eating disorder care. So this particular girl, she came out of the hospital becoming extremely traumatized and her symptoms not getting any better. And still a lot of the blame and the cost is on the individual and the family. So given your work on inpatient cultures and the moral worlds of the treatment, how would you interpret a system like this? And how does such a structure shape ideas of responsibility, care, and blame?
Great question, yes. We see similar things in the United States as well. So I am familiar with this kind of dynamic where that may be the only care that's available to somebody. And so it seems like that's better than nothing. And I guess it does maybe keep somebody alive, which is of course essential, but there are other things that come along with that. Like you said, like it can be very traumatizing, especially for young people to be in a general psychiatric population. And then also, of course, the nurses and doctors don't necessarily know like what they need to do, or they can't put extra resources toward this one patient when there's, 20 others that they're taking care of, right? So it's a very tricky situation for everybody involved. And I think some of the implications of that are that it perpetuates this idea of patients with eating disorders as being difficult, of not wanting to get well, because of course, from the perspective of nurses and doctors on a unit like that, they are causing disruption. They are requiring additional time and energy and attention that they just don't have to give. So, I think a situation like that, it not only, can produce trauma for the person going through it, but it can really reinforce for the clinicians a lot of these ideas that really are not proper to the eating disorder itself. It's about the system that this is happening within. And so, I don't think anybody's personally at fault for that, because I can certainly understand from all sides how that comes to be the situation. But yeah, that is the danger of not having people who are specifically trained in how to respond to these kind of conditions, is it just, puts burden on everybody and ends up being displaced onto the patient as somebody who doesn't want to get better.
Yeah, thank you. 레베카 교수님께서는 이제 미국에서 사실 이러한 일들이 조금 자주 일어난다고 말씀을 해주셨고, 결코 이제 뭐 생소한 그런 케이스가 아니라라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 사실 이제 그 입원한 환자도 굉장히 트라우마타이징 하는 걸 겪지만, 거기에서 훈련을 제대로 받지 않은 간호사, 그 다음에 이제 의사들, 그리고 이제 그 의료 시스템을 이루고 있는 사람들도 본인들이 무슨 일을 어떻게 할지 모르기 때문에 굉장히 그들도 엄청난 스트레스와 그 다음에 힘듦을 같이 겪고 있다고 말씀 주셨고요. 그래서 그건 아마 레베카 교수님이 당사자이시면서 동시에 또 이제 치료하시는 분이라서 그 모든 이면들을 본인이 잘 이해하고 있다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 이 환자들 자체도 본인이 이렇게 호전되고 싶어 하지 않은 의지를 또 갖고 있고, 그런 환자들을 또 치료하려고 하다 보면 의료진이 또 추가로 시간을 쏟아지기 때문에 굉장히 이제 부담이 되는 그러한 진료의 형태가 될 수밖에 없다. 그래서 사실 그 누구의 개인에게도 우리가 그 질타를 할 수 없다라는 걸 조금 잘 이해했으면 좋겠다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다.
왜 오늘은 질문이?
제가 질문 하나 더
네.
먼저 하겠습니다. 네. So Rebecca, I have another question. So you talked about, and as we're all very much aware, it's eating disorder patients. There is a lack of will for them wanting to not get well, and you've also repeatedly mentioned in your lecture, it's very hard for them to convince to get better. What are some tools you as a clinician have used to trying to convince and to alter that mind? Because if we think about cancer patients, for example, I think the assumption is that we want to treat, they want to live, right? But then with eating disorder, it's very hard because it's the other way around. And I think it's also different to, let's say, schizophrenia or depression, but eating disorder patients, physically have the will not to get better. So what kind of tactics have you used, and how can we understand that in general?
That's a great question. How I've approached it with my clients. I think first it's important to understand what people are often trying to express when they say things like, I don't know if I want to get better, or I don't know if I can get better. I think trying to persuade, whether it's somebody with an eating disorder or somebody else who might be feeling suicidal, like trying to persuade them to live for life's sake is difficult when their experience of life is miserable, right? So if somebody is really suffering and has a really difficult time in life, just saying, oh, you can do it, you can stay alive, that's not going to be very motivating. So I think what I found to be most useful is to help people start to see that the life they have been living is not what we're asking them to continue. That the goal is not to stay alive at all costs, but to build a life that they want to live, which is a very different sort of thing. And so I think helping people see that, like, you're not just relegated to returning to the same stuff that was making you miserable before. We want to make life something that you feel passionate about, that you feel drawn to. And so that's going to require changes beyond the individual, as well as, whatever the individual is struggling with. And so I found that to be a better approach. And it really helps, I think, to, instead of having the clinician and the client kind of on opposite sides, it's like, let's work together to figure out how to help you build a life that you will actually want to stick around for. So that's kind of the approach that I tend to use.
Yeah, thank you. 네, 제가 드린 질문은 무엇이었냐면, 사실 이제 레베카 교수님도 이제 강의에서 여러 번 말씀하셨듯이 섭식장애 환자들의 특징 중에 하나가 본인들이 더 나아지고 싶다는 의지가 적다는 부분인 것 같습니다. 그래서 예를 들어서 암 환자 같은 경우에는 이제 더 오래 사는 게 당연한 전제이지만 섭식장애 환자들은 대부분 자기가 더 나아지고 싶은지도 잘 모르겠고 나아지고 싶은 의지도 없는 경우가 많다고 하는데요. 이러할 때 이제 이 레베카 교수님께서 그 치료자로서 환자들을 어떻게 어프로치를 하고 우리가 이거에서 어떻게 이해를 해야 되는가에 대해서 제가 질문을 던져드렸습니다. 이에 대해서 레베카 교수님이 하신 말씀은 그냥 그러니까 환자들이 대부분 저는 더 이상 더 나아지고 싶지 않아요 라는 말을 할 때 무엇을 말하고 싶은지를 이해하는 게 중요하다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 그리고 그들에게 그냥 단순히 살기 위해서 살아야 된다라는 것을 강조하는 것은 별로 도움되지 않는다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 근데 대부분 환자들이 그렇게 생각하는 큰 이유에는 그동안의 삶이 굉장히 절망적이었기 때문에 앞으로 삶을 더 이어나갈 때도 또 절망적일 거라는 것을 이제 기대를 하고 있어서 본인이 설계하고 싶고 본인이 살아가고 싶은 삶을 살 수 있도록 내가 도와주겠다라고 하는 그런 대화가 굉장히 중요하다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 그게 결국 치료자로서 이제 같이 그러한 살고 싶은 삶, 그 당시 조금 더 살고 싶은 이 삶을 설계해 나가는 거가 좀 중요한 이 회복의 시작이 아닐까라고 말씀 주셨습니다. 네.
네, 너무 좋은 질문과 답변이었어요. 김관욱 교수님 질문이 하나 더 있네요. 네, 관욱 교수님은 가정의학과 의사시기도 한데 의학교육 받을 때도 전문의가 돼서도 단 한 번도 섭식장애 치료에 대해서 교육을 5분 이상 받은 적이 없습니다. 지금도 그럴 것 같습니다. 오히려 비만 치료에 대한 약물 치료만 지속적으로 받았습니다. 미국에서도 의학교육에서 1시간도 채 교육을 받지 않는다고 했는데요. 한나절이라고 했나? 1시간이면 아무튼 그렇다면 미국의 상황에서 당신은 의료인들의 섭식장애에 대한 인식 개선을 위해서 어떤 구체적 방안이 있다고 생각하는지 실제로도 시도한 것이 있는지 궁금합니다. 저도 섭식장애 애드보커시 운동을 하면서 교육에 대해서 아니면 뭐 재교육이나 수련에 대해서도 계속 강조를 하고 있는데요. 이런 프로그램이 있으면 좋겠죠. 근데 이게 전체 의료 시스템이 공공이면 이거를 밀어붙이기가 쉬울 텐데 지금 우리는 또 그런 게 아니라서 좀 어려운 부분이 있는데요. 미국은 어떤지도 궁금합니다.
So Rebecca, this is another question from Professor Kim himself. So he's actually a trained family medicine doctor in Korea, and when he looks back in his medical training years, he doesn't recall much getting trained or learning about eating disorders exceeding more than 5 minutes. rather there was a lot of emphasis and a lot of training and information on treating obesity and related medications. So you also mentioned something very similar in the lecture today. So what is currently the United States perhaps doing to change this, and also not only raise awareness of eating disorders amongst the public, but also to medical doctors who are under training, and what kind of systems can we implement?
Yeah, the United States is not doing much about it. It's pretty similar here in terms of very minimal attention to eating disorders, unless it's binge eating disorder linked to obesity. There's more attention to that. But only in the sense of it produces these medical consequences, right? Not in terms of it as an eating disorder itself. So even in the discipline of psychiatry, there's very little attention, like half a day or a day maybe, on just kind of like, here's what these things are, but no deep dive into like, what are best strategies for treating it, or how might we understand them differently? So, yeah, I'm not sure what the process is for getting more of that into the medical curriculum. But that I think is so critically important, because I have encountered, and many people have encountered again and again, physicians who, you know, mean well. They're trying to treat their patients the best they can, but they don't have the knowledge. And so they end up saying things that can be very harmful, doing things that can undermine treatment, you know, and again, not on purpose, of course, but it happens. And so that is a really important question. And I'm not sure what the process is for changing medical education, but it's something that needs attention.
Thank you. 미국에서도 굉장히 비슷하게 많은 일들이 일어나지 않고 있다고 말씀을 해 주셨고요. 특히 섭식장애 이야기를 할 때, 뭐 거식증에 대한 이야기는 거의 없고, 뭐 주로 이제 이제 폭식증에 대해서는 어쨌든 약물적 연관이 있기 때문에 그런 담론들이 오가고 하지만, 아직 전반적인 섭식장애에 대한 인식은 많이 없는 것 같다고 말씀하셨습니다. 그래서 미국 내에서도 어떻게 수련이들의 인식을 바꿀지는 본인도 아직은 잘 모르겠지만, 좀 앞으로 이어나갈 대화가 있어야 된다고 말씀을 주셨습니다.
그게 궁금해요. 그러니까 우리나라는 국내에서 섭식장애에 관심이 있어도 딱히 교육을 받거나 수련받을 곳이 자체가 없잖아요. 근데 미국에는 그래도 섭식장애를 치료할 수 있는 스페셜리스트들이 있잖아요. 의사든 아니면 심리학자든 영양사든. 근데 이분들은 어떻게 따로 어디서 교육을 받는지가 궁금합니다.
So in Korea, another issue with is even if you're a clinician, let's say a psychologist or a medical doctor under training, if you are even interested in the subject of eating disorders, there are no established training programs for them to go and learn more about these disease. In the United States, is it a similar case, and where do they go to learn?
So for physicians, really the only place for them to go really while they're still in training would be to do like a psychiatric residency at a hospital that treats eating disorders. That would be the way to do it, really. There are training programs and certificate programs and things available. They tend to be focused more on therapists or dietitians, which is of course important. But in terms of physicians, there are a few kind of specialized things, but it's like you can get a day training or something like that. It's not like the immersive, really working with this population that a lot of people would need, unless you're specifically in a psychiatric residency program that happens to be at a place that treats eating disorders. So it's really difficult.
Yep. 의사 자격증이 있는 사람들 같은 경우에는 주로 이제 관련해서 그 정신과 수련, 레전치를 받을 수가 있다고 말씀을 주셨고, 그렇지만 대부분의 섭식장애에 관련된 프로그램들은 상담사나 영양사들에게 조금 더 초점이 되어 있다고 말씀 주셨습니다.
네. 그래서 우리나라는 섭식장애 교육을 수련을 받으려면 외국으로 다 나가야 되는. 그렇죠.
안녕하세요. 저 질문 드리고 싶습니다. 우선은 인류학자로서의 정체성을 잃지 않으면서 그 치료자로서도 참여하셨다는 얘기가 굉장히 중요하게 다가왔습니다. 그래서 치료자로 계셨을 때에는 실질적으로 그들을 만나는 상담사 역할이나 혹은 그쪽의 역할을 담당하셨을 거라고 저는 상상이 되는데요. 어, 교수님께서 그 치료사로 계셨을 때 그분들한테 제공하셨던 치료의 방식 혹은 중재 방식 혹은 아까 사이코테라피도 말씀하시긴 하셨는데 어떤 그 치료 그 관점을 가지고 개입하셨는지 그래서 그 개입이 다른 의료진 그다음에 다른 영양사 이렇게 입체적으로 한 팀이 되어서 케어를 하셨다라고 하는데 그게 음, 정말 효과를 이렇게 잘 가지고 있다고 보시는지도 좀 궁금합니다. 제가 질문이 약간 문장 안에 섞여 있어서 선생님, 타라 선생님께 조금 죄송한 마음이 있는데요. 또 한 가지는 음, 교수님께서 이 연구들을 통해서 회복에 그러니까 섭식장애 환자의 치료 혹은 회복에 대해서 교수님은 어, 뭐라고 이렇게 지금은 정의 내리고 계신지가 물론 환자들마다 다 다르다라는 건 알고 있습니다. 그러나 교수님 마음속에서 이런 게 회복이다라고 이렇게 어, 재정의하고 계시는 게 궁금합니다. 저 지금 한 가지만 더 약간 의미를 조금 더 분명하게 하고 싶어서 제가 궁금해서 그러는데요. 아까 맨 처음에 장례식장을 가는 그 에피소드가 나왔습니다. 근데 그 장례식장을 가는 그 분이 갑자기 사망하셨다고 했는데 말씀해 주셨던 세 개의 사례가 있었잖아요. 그래서 거기에 들어가는 어떤 것으로 이분이 사망하셨는지, 왜 사망하셨는지가 좀 궁금해서 를 분명히 조금 더 알고 싶습니다.
제가 마지막 부분은 잘 이해를 못했는데,
이분이 처음에 사망한 앨리스는 심장마비로 갑자기 사망한 걸로 되어 있는데, 세 가지 사례도 글쎄요. 그러니까 이분이 정말 완치해서 돌아갔는데, 아니면, unexpected하게 사망을 한 건지, 아니면 완치되지 않은 상태에서 그러니까 퇴원을 하신 건지, 이게 궁금하신 것 같아요.
그것도 궁금하지만 넉 달 뒤에 사망했다고 하니까 사례 3개 안에 연관이 좀 있는지 그런 경우에 해당하는 건지가 또 좀 궁금해서 물어보고 싶었습니다. 조금 더 그분의 사망이 그냥 에피소드로 지나가지 않고 저도 환자분들을 사망으로 보낸 적이 있었기 때문에 좀 더 실제적으로 다가와서 좀 더 여쭤보고 싶었습니다.
그 앨리스라는 분의 사망의 경위에
네,
대해서 궁금하신 거죠?
예.
네, 알겠습니다.
그런데 사망의 그 사례를 3가지를 말씀하셨잖아요.
음.
그래서 그 경우에 해당이 좀 있는지, 그러니까 레베카 선생님이 사례를 3가지 사례를 가지고 또 말씀해 주셨는데 그 경우와 좀 연관이 있는 지점에서 그분이 사망을 하신 것가 있는지, 물론 사망한 경위가 자세하게 궁금하지는 않습니다. 그러나 갑자기 이제 잘 지내다가 아주 열정적으로 회복을 기대하고 있었는데 갑자기 사망했다고 하니까 레베카 선생님이 또 만나셨던 분이라고 하니까 그런 음, 게 좀 실질적으로 좀 궁금했습니다. 그리고 그 사망을
어떻게
치료자로서는 또
대응하셨는지.
어떻게 받아들이시는지도 좀.
네, 알겠습니다.
네. 이거 마지막 질문으로 하겠습니다.
네. So, hi, Rebecca. So this is one of the last questions. It's in 2 to 3 parts, so bear with me. The first question is, the / comment is, it was very impressive that you had a career as an anthropologist and now as someone who treats, becoming a clinician for eating disorders. So the person who asked the question wanted to know, you as a therapist treating eating disorder patients, what is your method of intervention and also the framework that you utilize in your practice? And you also highlighted the importance of multidisciplinary approach, and has that been effective so far? So that was the first question. The second question is, you've done an extensive research on eating disorders so far, and I assume your definition and your understanding of the disease also continues to evolve. At this point, from all the research you've done, how would you define recovery in a short sentence? And the last question is, you mentioned experiencing some deaths of your patients, and I think the anecdote on Alice was quite touching to a lot of us. So wanted to know, because it seemed like she was very motivated to continue her therapy and quite passionate, but then she unfortunately passed away. So how did that, how did you receive that when you heard the news about it as a clinician? So yeah, that's a three-part.
Great. So the first part about kind of the framework that I use for working with eating disorder patients. I only work because I have an outpatient practice. When I see eating disorder patients, it's only after when they're stable, medically stable. Like that's the most important thing, obviously. And it's critical that they have a whole treatment team. So not only me as a therapist, but they're seeing a psychiatrist, they have a medical doctor, they have a dietitian or nutritionist, and that we can all be in communication to make sure everybody's on the same page, right? As far as like the actual framework, it's really tailored to each person. I mean, I have a theoretical framework that I'm working with from the book, right? In terms of understanding this is an existential question that people are grappling with. So I think it's really easy as a clinician to kind of get distracted by the food and weight piece, which is very important, right? That somebody's medically stable, but it's very easy for that to also hijack the therapy. So that's kind of the topic that we're talking about all the time. And sometimes that does need to be discussed. But I think continuing to bring it back to like what is really underneath that. And that's going to look different for each person in terms of the strategy that I use. Maybe it's my anthropological training and clinical training about really trying to understand how the person themselves is viewing their situation and using their language and using things that are meaningful to them to try to communicate those kind of questions around the existential parts of the treatment. So I would say, there's the two parts. There's the making sure that their physical well-being is attended to and that's something we're keeping track of. But in the therapy, really trying to help them make that shift to understanding that there's much deeper issues involved. And so, like I said, that's going to vary depending on the person in terms of how I actually approach that. The second part of the question, I remember the third part. What was the second part of the question?
The second part question was, how do you define recovery now?
Oh, yes, recovery. This is a really contentious issue, I think, in the eating disorder world. There's different contingents have different definitions. If you are an insurance company, you have one definition that's based on stability and weight in labs. If you're a medical doctor, you might have another definition, so there's multiple definitions. For me, recovery is when the eating disorder recedes enough that you can really be fully present in your life. And so by that, I mean, for example, I had a client who I had met first in Cedar Grove. She was a client there. She was in her early 20s and had really struggled with anorexia, bulimia, self-harm for years, many years. And she had gone on a trip to New York to visit a friend of hers, and they went to see a show on Broadway. And when she came back, she said to me that she had this experience that was really unusual for her, and that she was sitting in the audience at this performance And she felt herself like absorbed into what was going on, into the theatrics of the performance and the story, and was like really in it and not thinking about her eating disorder. And that was a new experience for her. So like that kind of thing to me is really where recovery lies. It's in the ability to be engaged in life in a way that is not always hampered by these constant thoughts and worries and anxiety about the eating disorder. So that'll show up differently for different people, but that's kind of basically where that is.
I think something goes, right?
Yeah, it's not like a one and done. Yeah, you definitely, you know, in her case, she had that experience, but then once she was back home, it felt elusive. But I think even knowing that you're able to do that can be very motivating for people. Like, oh, there is hope that someday I could actually be like that all the time, you know? In terms of losing clients, it's very difficult. I mean, Allison was not my personal client, but I did know her. And it's heartbreaking. It's especially in a situation like that where she was really motivated to get better. We all know that recovery is not a linear process, and people relapse or lapse. You know, they're not just going to wake up and be totally free of behaviors and things. So that could happen to anybody, and it is really heartbreaking. I think for me personally, what it inspires in me is really anger, honestly. Anger that this did not have to happen. You know, this did not have to happen. And sometimes it's inevitable, right? We can't prevent everybody from suffering or death or anything like that. But there is still so much we can do that could make situations like Allison's, you know, less common than they are. And so it motivates me to continue to do this work.
Thank you. 지진님, 그 마지막 질문까지 물어보고 한 번에 말씀드릴까요? 아니면 지금 꺼내서 할까요?
시간이
퀵하게 여쭤볼 수 있을 것 같아가지고.
네네네.
And Rebecca, so before we move on, this is the very last question we have on the chat, and I think it's also quite important to kind of address because the questionnaire, she is someone who is aspiring to study cultural anthropology. The crux of the question is, when you conduct research on patients with histories of mental disorders, you often have a gap in that research because perhaps the patient might not show up to the clinics or to get treatment. So sometimes it's really hard to make a conclusive argument of how these patients are doing because there's a huge loss of those patients. How do you make about that? Like, how do you conduct research in those situations, and how do you what has your experience been when you were conducting research in situations like these?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that is, you know, part of why this particular research was about the clinic. You know, because it's really hard to follow people. I mean, it's certainly possible, but it is a challenge. And depending on what kind of condition they're dealing with, it just really may be difficult for them to stay connected or, you know, make those kinds of long-term plans or whatever the case may be. So I think just accepting that is going to be part of the situation, that's part of what the story is, trying to understand, you know, why is that? Why do people fall out of contact with caregivers or whatever? But, you know, I think we just have to do, I guess it depends on what the goal of the research is. You know, if the goal of the research is to measure an outcome of a treatment, then that's obviously more of a problem. As an anthropologist, part of what we can do is to shine a light on what this process is and what it looks like for people. And sometimes that's going to be incomplete, or people drop out and come back, or, you know, things like that. So, you know, it is challenging, but I think as anthropologists, if we remain focused on, you know, what is the story that's unfolding in front of us, whatever that is, and it's not going to necessarily be a nice, tidy situation like somebody who might have, you know, a cardiac issue that you can then call in 6 months and you know where to find them and, you know, all of that. So I think it's just accepting that is part of what we're working with, and that's part of what our job is.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll continue the translation. 첫 번째, 제마님께서 말씀 주신 이제 질문 세 가지가 있었습니다. 첫 번째는, 그 레베카 교수님께서 환자들을 이제 치료를 할 때 어떠한 프레임워크와 이제 어떠한 이제 태도로 이제 치료하신다는 질문을 하셨고, 그래서 레베카 교수님은 현재 이제 외래 환자들만 보시기 때문에 대부분의 자기를 이제 보는 환자들이 어느 정도 의료적으로 좀 안정이 취해져 있는 환자들이라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 굉장히 개개인마다 이제 어떠한 프레임워크를 이제 인용하냐는 굉장히 다르다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 아까도 이제 말씀해 주셨지만 이 치료에서 좀 본인이 하고자 하는 거는 이 먹는 거와 이 체중 증가에만 집중하는 것이 아니라 이 개인의 어떤 실존주의적인 그리고 이제 개인이 왜 이러한 걸 경험하는지 좀 깊이 알려고 하는 게 조금 중요할 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 어떤 이제 물리적 웰빙과 그다음에 어떤 실존주의, 현존적인 그런 웰빙까지 챙기는 거가 중요할 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 두 번째는 이 회복에 대한 정의를 지금 시점에서 어떻게 하시냐에 대해서 부분은 사실 이 정의는 굉장히 이제 누구한테 물어봐도 다르다고 말씀하셨어요. 보험사가 하는 정의 다를 거고, 뭐 정신과사가 하는 정의가 다를 거 하겠지만, 본인이 생각하실 때 이제, 섭식장애의 어떤 회복의 현재의 정의는 더 이상 개인의 삶이 이 먹는 생각과 그다음 불안으로 뒤덮이지 않고 다른 것까지 이제 받아들일 수 있는 상태가 됐을 때라고 말씀하셨습니다. 그래서 대표적인 예시로 이제 20대 어떤 여성 환자가 있었고, 그 환자가 굉장히 심각하게 거식증과 폭식증을 이제 반복을 하였다가, 이 환자가 어느 날 이제 뉴욕에 가서 친구와 브로드웨이 쇼를 보는데, 그때 처음으로 자기가 이제 그런 이제 먹는 거에 대한 생각이 좀 줄어들기 시작했고, 그 순간에 집중할 수 있었다는 이제 경험을 공유했다고 합니다. 그래서 그러한 경험을 한 번이라도 경험을 하는 것이 회복의 시작의 증표라고 본인은 본다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 네, 마지막으로 이제 앨리슨 환자에 대한 이야기를 좀 말씀해 주셨는데, 사실 이제 본인이 직접 치료한 환자는 아니었고 그냥 그지만 그 환자를 잘 알고 있었던 상황이라고 했습니다. 그래서 그 소식을 들었을 때 굉장히 마음이 아팠다고 했었고, 또 이거를 통해서 얼마나 이 섭식장애가 이 재발과 그다음에 이제 회복이 계속 반복되는 그런 굉장히 복잡한 질병인가지 다시 한번 생각해보게 되었고, 개인적으로는 많은 큰 분노에 좀 찼다고 하셨습니다. 그래서 그런 일이 일어났으면 안 됐을 텐데 왜 그랬을까라는 질문을 수없이 스스로에게 던졌다고 하셨고, 그 질문을 통해서 결국 본인이 하는 일을 좀 더 열심히 하자라는 걸 좀 결론을 내렸다고 하셨습니다. 그래서 굉장히 마음이 아팠고 분노에 갇혔다라고 말씀해 주셨고요. 근데 마지막으로 여기 지금 코멘트 이 질문창에 올려주신 질문까지 제가 여쭤봤습니다. 그래서 이 문화인류학 석사를 준비하시는 분께서 어쨌든 정신질환 겪은 환자들이 클리닉에 잘 가지 않고 하는 그런 이제 데이터의 로스가 있는 경우가 많은데, 이런 거에 대해서 어떻게 조금 연구를 진행하셨는지에 대해서 질문을 여쭤봤고, 우선 이 본인이 치료자 하는 어떤 이제 그러니까 어쨌든 교수님께서 하시는 말씀은 이러한 것을 이 정신과 치료의 어떤 그 연구의 한 부분으로 받아들이자가 좀 결론이었던 것 같습니다. 그래서 만약에 진행하고자 하는 연구의 목적이 이 환자가 치료를 받았을 때 그 아웃컴을 측정하는 거다라고 하면 뭐 어쩔 수 없이 이 로스가 좀 큰 영향을 미치겠지만, 인류학자로서 우리가 고민해 볼 수 있는 거는 왜 그럴까? 왜 환자들이 클리닉에 나타나지 않고 이런 로스가 일어날 거에 대한 현상에 대해서 본인이 한번 의문을 가지고 그거에 대한 이제 의미를 찾으려고 하는 게 중요한 과정일 거라고 말씀해 주셨고요. 그래서 이렇게 불완전한 데이터 자체도 우리가 인류학자로서 받아들이는 거가 조금 중요하고, 그 스토리가 이면에 무엇일지를 한번 연구하는 것도 연구의 일부분이겠다까지 말씀해 주셨습니다. 네.
마지막 답변은 정말 흥미로웠어요. 다시 한번 생각할 수 있게 해줬고요. 너무 많은 시간을 교수님께서 뺏는 것 같아서 좀 죄송스러우니까 이제 좀 끝내도록 하겠습니다. 너무 감사드리고요. 교수님께도 너무 감사하다고 전해주세요.
Hi, Ruka. Thanks for staying with us in the very early hours in the East Coast, I imagine is where you are.
I'm in St. Louis, so I'm in the middle of the country.
Midwest, right? Yeah. Thank you so much for staying with us until about 10 past. Hope you have a great week and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for your participation today. We learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
감사합니다. 모두 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
네, 내일 뵙겠습니다.
네.
안녕.